Hey Night Owls, and welcome back to Midnight Markers. I'm gonna do things a little different today because I'm very interested in the Lindsay Clancy case. So I want to speak on that. I do want to state though that everything that I'm about to talk about reflects testimony and arguments that are presented in court and should not be treated as a finding that either side's theory is true. The prosecution's claims are allegations unless and until proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Likewise, the defense's claims about postpartum psychosis, medication effect, and Lindsay's mental state are arguments that the jury must evaluate. This is an ongoing trial as of today. So, let's get this started. Lindsay Clancy is currently on trial in Massachusetts for the deaths of her three young children, Cora, Dawson, and Callan, who died on January 24th, 2023, inside the family's home in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Clancy has pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. She does not dispute that she killed the children. The central issue at trial is whether she was criminally responsible for her actions at the time. The prosecution says Clancy deliberately planned and carried out the killings. The defense says she was suffering from severe mental illness, particularly postpartum psychosis, bipolar disorder, depression, paranoia, and the effects of extensive psychiatric medication, and was not criminally responsible. If convicted of first-degree murder, Clancy faces life in prison without parole. If found not criminally responsible because of mental illness, she would instead be committed to a psychiatric facility. So what happened on January 24th of 2023? Lindsay Clancy was at home with her 3 children, Cora, who's 5 years old, Dawson, who is 3 years old, and Callan, who is 8 months old. According to the evidence presented at trial, Clancy strangled all 3 children using exercise bands. Her husband, Patrick Clancy, had been home with the family, but left the house to run errands. The prosecution argues that Clancy intentionally created an opportunity to be alone with the children. After the children were killed, Clancy jumped from a second-story window in what authorities have described as a suicide attempt. She survived, but suffered catastrophic injuries and is now paralyzed from the waist down. Patrick returned home and discovered what had happened. His 911 call was later played for the jury. Clancy became visibly emotional while the call was played in court. So the central question here is, was Lindsay Clancy criminally responsible for these murders? This is the heart of the entire trial. The defense is not primarily arguing that the children weren't killed by Lindsay. Instead, defense attorney Kevin Reddington is arguing that Lindsay was experiencing an extreme psychiatric episode and did not understand the nature or wrongfulness of what she was doing. The defense has focused heavily on postpartum psychosis and bipolar disorder. They argue that Lindsay's mental health deteriorated dramatically during the months before the killings. The prosecution acknowledges that Lindsay had serious mental health problems, but argues that mental illness does not automatically mean someone is legally insane. Prosecutors say that Lindsay was capable of planning, organizing, and carrying out the killings. So, the prosecution's theory. Prosecutors have presented the jury with evidence that say that she has demonstrated planning and deliberative behaviors. One major part of their case involves the errands Patrick was sent on before the killings. Prosecutors argue Lindsay deliberately arranged for Patrick to leave the house so she would have time alone with the children. They have also presented digital evidence, including internet searches involving postpartum psychosis, hallucinations, suicide, psychiatric medications, depression, ways to die, other mental health-related subjects. Prosecutors argue that these searches show Lindsay was researching mental illness and suicide and was capable of deliberately preparing for what she intended to do. The prosecution has also questioned whether Lindsay's attempted suicide was genuine or whether portions of her behavior afterward were staged. That theory has been strongly disputed by the defense. Now, the defense's theory. The defense paints a dramatically different picture. They say that Lindsay was a loving mother whose mental health deteriorated following the birth of Callan. The defense has presented evidence that Lindsay experienced severe depression, became increasingly paranoid, struggled with sleep, expressed suicidal thoughts, worried about harming her children, sought psychiatric treatment repeatedly, contacted mental health professionals, was hospitalized, was prescribed numerous psychiatric medications. The defense argues that she was eventually placed on a complicated combination of medications that may have worsened her psychiatric condition. The defense has also argued that Lindsay experienced psychotic symptoms, including hearing voices. Psychologist Dr. Paul Zeisel testified that Lindsay told him she had heard a male voice telling her to kill herself and the children. Zeisel ultimately testified that he believed Lindsay met the legal standard for lack of criminal responsibility. One of the most emotional parts of the trial has involved Patrick Clancy. Patrick has testified about the family's life, Lindsay's mental health struggles, and the events surrounding the children's deaths. He has also publicly said that he forgives Lindsay. His testimony has been particularly significant because prosecutors and the defense interpret Lindsay's behavior around him differently. The prosecution has pointed to the fact that Patrick did not see obvious signs of psychosis immediately before the killings. The defense emphasized that Lindsay's deterioration had been occurring for months and that someone experiencing psychosis does not necessarily appear continuously irrational to everyone around them. Now, the 911 call that was part of Patrick's testimony. The jury was able to hear Patrick's emergency call. The audio itself was not publicly broadcast because of restrictions concerning sensitive evidence. Clancy became extremely emotional while the call was played in court. The prosecution has used the aftermath of the killings to establish what happened inside the home. The defense has used the same events to emphasize the devastating psychiatric and emotional circumstances surrounding Lindsay's attempted suicide. The jury has also been able to visit the house. One unusual part of the trial occurred when jurors were taken to Lindsay and Patrick's former house in Duxbury. The jury was allowed to see the physical layout of the property, including areas relevant to the prosecution's timeline. The jurors also traveled past locations connected to the events, including the restaurants and pharmacy involved in the errands Patrick was sent to complete. The visit was important because both sides have presented competing interpretations of the physical timeline. The prosecution says the layout helps demonstrate how Lindsay was able to carry out the killings while Patrick was gone. The defense has used the circumstances to support its argument about Lindsay's mental state. The mental health and medical evidence. A major portion of this trial has focused on Lindsay's treatment before the killings. The defense has argued that she received inadequate psychiatric care. One defense expert, psychiatrist Dr. Donald Kunde, I could be saying that wrong, I don't quite remember how it was pronounced, criticized the medical records as sparse and questioned the lack of certain testing, including blood tests, that could have examined possible thyroid and hormonal issues. The defense has also emphasized the large number of psychiatric medications Lindsay had been prescribed. The prosecution, meanwhile, has presented testimony from medical professionals who treated or evaluated Lindsay and who did not observe psychosis in the way the defense describes it. Psychiatrist Dr. Jennifer Tufts and psychiatric nurse practitioner Rebecca Gelada testified that Lindsay did not display psychotic symptoms during their interactions with her, and denied suicidal or homicidal thoughts at various points. The prosecution has used that testimony to argue that Lindsay had access to treatment and was capable of communicating her condition to medical professionals. Evidence from Lindsay's phone and the Apple Watch. Digital evidence has been another major part of the prosecution's case. A digital forensics expert testified about information obtained from Lindsay's devices. The evidence included internet searches, text messages, phone activity, information related to depression and mental health, Apple Watch activity, heart rate information, and activity levels. Prosecutors argued that the digital timeline provides clues about what Lindsay was doing before the killings. They also pointed to the point when activity from her devices changed or stopped around the time of the children's deaths. The defense has argued that the digital evidence should be considered in the larger context of someone experiencing severe psychiatric illness. The prosecution's case has rested. After more than 4 weeks of testimony and more than 70 prosecution witnesses, the prosecution rested its case. The witnesses included Patrick Clancy, family members, doctors, nurses, police officers, first responders, mental health professionals, forensic and digital analysts, and other witnesses connected to Lindsay's life and the investigation. The prosecution's final witnesses included digital forensic testimony concerning Lindsay's Apple Watch and other electronic devices. The defense can then begin presenting their case. The defense has called members of Lindsay's family to describe how dramatically she changed before the killings. Her mother, Paula Musgrove, testified that Lindsay had expressed frightening thoughts about harming herself and the children. Her sister, Allison Ozga, also described changes in Lindsay's behavior and mental state. The testimony was intended to show the jury that the problems were not suddenly invented after the killings. Family members described Lindsay becoming increasingly fearful, withdrawn, and distressed. The defense argues that these warning signs demonstrate a progressive psychiatric deterioration. The former mother-in-law's testimony. Susan Clancy, Patrick's mother and Lindsay's former mother-in-law, also testified. She described Lindsay as a loving and devoted mother who was struggling desperately with her mental health. Her testimony supported the defense's argument that the woman who killed the children was not behaving like the person the family knew before her psychiatric deterioration. At one point, the prosecution questioned Susan about her Catholic beliefs and whether murder is considered a mortal sin. The judge stopped the questioning and instructed the jury to disregard the question. The exchange generated significant attention because of the unusual nature of its questioning. Then the defense called their expert witnesses. The defense has focused heavily on psychiatric testimony. Dr. Donald Kunde criticized Lindsay's medical treatment. Dr. Paul Zeisel, a psychologist who has met with Lindsay numerous times since the killings, provided some of the most important testimony for the defense. Zeisel testified that Lindsay's psychiatric condition had become severe enough that she was not criminally responsible for her actions. He described her as suffering from serious mental illness and rejected the idea that she was simply pretending to be psychotic. The prosecution has aggressively challenged Zeisel's conclusions, including questioning errors in his report and pointing out that some medical records did not contain references to hallucinations. The voices in the evidence. One of the most significant defense claims is that Lindsay heard a male voice instructing her to kill herself and her children. According to Zeisel's testimony, Lindsay told her husband during a speakerphone conversation that she had heard a voice. The defense says that the evidence of postpartum psychosis. The prosecution disputes the characterization and has emphasized that Lindsay did not consistently report hallucinations to medical providers. This disagreement is extremely important because the jury must ultimately decide whether Lindsay's mental state prevented her from being legally responsible. There's a controversy with the McLean Hospital witness. Another unusual development involved Emily Thorndike, a former McLean Hospital social worker who had become publicly involved in the case. Thorndike had posted a widely viewed TikTok criticizing aspects of the hospital's treatment and the prosecution's presentation of certain facts. The defense wanted her to testify about staffing and conditions at McLean during Lindsay's hospitalization. However, Judge William Sullivan ultimately ruled that Thorndike could not testify before the jury. The judge questioned the relevance of her testimony, including the fact that she was not employed at the hospital during Lindsay's specific admission. Defense can still use other evidence regarding hospital staffing and treatment. The prosecution's argument about postpartum psychosis is essential. A mental illness is not the same as legal insanity. Prosecutors have pointed to testimony from medical professionals who did not observe psychosis. They have also pointed to Lindsay's behavior, planning, searches, and actions immediately before the killings. They argue that she knew what she was doing and intentionally created an opportunity to be alone with the children. The prosecution therefore wants the jury to conclude that Lindsay was criminally responsible. Defense's argument about postpartum psychosis. The defense's position is essentially Lindsay was experiencing a psychiatric crisis so severe that she could no longer accurately understand reality or control her actions. They argue that her mental health deteriorated after childbirth. She repeatedly sought help. She experienced suicidal thoughts. She feared harming the children. She experienced paranoia. She may have experienced hallucinations. She was prescribed numerous psychiatric medications. Her treatment may have worsened her condition. Behavior was consistent with severe postpartum psychiatric illness. Defense wants the jury to find Lindsay as not criminally responsible. As of August 19, 2026, the defense had been continuing to present their case. That day, the judge unexpectedly ended proceedings early because of an unspecified, unforeseen circumstance. The trial is expected to continue. The defense still has testimony and evidence to present, and the prosecution may have an opportunity to present rebuttal evidence. After both sides finish, the judge will give the jury instructions. Prosecutors and defense attorneys will make closing arguments. The jury will deliberate. The jury will determine whether Lindsay is guilty or not guilty of the charges. If the jury finds that she was not criminally responsible because of mental illness, the outcome would be a psychiatric commitment rather than a conventional prison sentence. Remember, everything that I've stated reflects testimony and arguments presented in court and should not be treated as a finding that either side theory is true. So that is where we have left off with this hearing as of August 19th. And I will continue to follow along and more episodes as this trial continues on. For now, Night Owls, continue to stay curious, subscribe and like. I will see you next time.